39 stab wounds, not 5, not 10. 39 separate plunges of a blade into flesh, bone, and organ. When dock laborer John Saunders Reeves descended the darkened stairwell of George Yard buildings in Whitechapel on the morning of the 7th of August, 1888, he found a woman lying in a pool of blood so vast it had seeped between the floorboards. Her throat had been punctured. Her lungs had been pierced. Her heart had been stabbed through. Her liver, spleen, and stomach bore wounds. Her lower abdomen and genitals had been targeted with a fury that suggested not mere murder but obliteration. The killer had used 2 different weapons, striking again and again in the pitch darkness of a tenement landing, while dozens of residents slept mere feet away. Not one of them heard a scream. This was the death of Martha Tabram, and many believe she was the first victim of the monster who would soon terrorize the world under the name Jack the Ripper. If you have found your way to this story, then you understand that some crimes demand to be remembered, not for the horror they contain, but for the lives that were stolen and the questions that remain unanswered. Before we continue, I ask you to subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, whether you are in London, New York, Sydney, or somewhere else entirely. Knowing who joins me in these investigations makes this feel less like a broadcast and more like a gathering of minds seeking truth in the darkness. Now let me tell you who Martha Tabram was before she became a footnote in the annals of murder. She was born Martha White on the 10th of May, 1849. In the Southwark district of South London, the youngest of 5 children born to Charles Samuel White, a warehouseman, and his wife Elizabeth Dowsett. The family lived at 17 Marshall Street, a modest address in a working-class neighborhood where respectability was measured in clean doorsteps and regular church attendance. Martha had 4 older siblings, Henry, Stephen, Esther, and Mary Ann, and by all accounts her childhood was unremarkable in its ordinariness. She was neither wealthy nor destitute, neither educated nor illiterate, simply one of millions of London children who grew up in the shadow of the great city's churning industries. When Martha was 16, her father abandoned the family. 6 months later, in November 1865, Charles Samuel White died at the age of 59 in Pitt Street, Southwark, having been unable to work for several months before his death. The loss of the family's primary breadwinner would have been devastating, forcing Martha's mother and siblings to find whatever employment they could to survive. For a young woman in Victorian London without means or connections, the options were grimly limited. Factory work, domestic service, or the needle trades offered meager wages for grueling hours. Marriage was often the only path to security, and Martha pursued it with the urgency of someone who understood that her window of opportunity would not remain open forever. In her late teens, Martha met Henry Samuel Tabram, a foreman furniture packer who offered the promise of stability and respectability. On Christmas Day, 1869, when Martha was 20 years old, the couple married at Trinity Church in St. Mary's Parish in Newington. The choice of date suggests either romantic sentiment or practical expedience, as Christmas weddings allowed couples to combine celebration with ceremony, while employers were least likely to dock wages for time away. The newlyweds moved to a house at 20 Marshall Street, close to Martha's childhood home, and for a brief period the future must have seemed bright. The marriage produced 2 sons. Frederick John Tabram was born in February 1871, and Charles Henry Tabram followed in December 1872. But even as Martha embraced motherhood, a shadow was falling across the household. She had begun drinking, and her drinking was not the genteel glass of sherry that respectable Victorian women might permit themselves, but the desperate, compulsive consumption of someone seeking oblivion. Her husband later described alcoholic fits that left her incapacitated. The arguments grew more frequent, the silences between them more bitter. In 1875, Henry Tabram left his wife, citing her intemperance as the cause. Martha was not prepared to accept abandonment quietly. She took out a court summons against Henry for desertion, and he agreed to pay her a weekly maintenance allowance of 12 shillings, a sum that might keep a frugal woman housed and fed if she supplemented it with occasional work. Henry paid this allowance regularly until he learned that Martha had turned to prostitution to supplement her income. He reduced the payments to half a crown. Then, in 1879, when he discovered she was living with another man named William Turner, He stopped the payments altogether. What drove Martha Tabram to prostitution? And the easy answer is poverty. And poverty was certainly a factor. A woman alone in Victorian London with no husband to support her and no family to fall back upon faced choices that were really no choices at all. She could starve respectably or survive by whatever means presented themselves. But there was also the drinking, which both caused and compounded her difficulties. The more she drank, the less capable she became of holding regular employment. The less she earned, the more she needed the quick money that street work provided. The more she worked the streets, the more she drank to numb herself to what she had become. It was a spiral that thousands of women fell into during the Victorian era, and very few ever climbed out. William Turner was a carpenter who drifted into Martha's life around 1876, and the two lived together on and off for the next 9 years, their relationship punctuated by her drinking and his inability to find steady work in his trade. They earned what they could by hawking cheap trinkets, menthol cones, needles, and pins on the streets of London. Martha's preferred pitch was Cheapside in the city of London, where the passing crowds of clerks and shoppers might drop a penny or two for her wares. To most who knew them, they were man and wife, and Martha was known throughout the district as Martha Turner rather than Martha Tabram. Turner would later describe their relationship with the weary resignation of someone who had long since stopped expecting better. "Since she has been living with me," he testified at the inquest into her death, "her character for sobriety was not good. If I gave her any money, she generally spent it in drink. In fact, it was always drink. I am a man of sober habits as a rule, and we usually agreed well enough together as long as she remained sober, but when she got the worse for drink, I left her. There was no quarrel then, I simply left her." This pattern of separation and reconciliation continued throughout their years together. Martha would disappear for days at a time, staying out late, drinking in public houses, and almost certainly selling herself on the streets. Turner knew, or at least suspected, what she was doing during these absences, but he said nothing. Perhaps he loved her despite everything. Perhaps he simply had nowhere else to go. In March 1888, Martha rented a room from Mary Bousfield at 4 Star Place, off Commercial Road in Whitechapel, for 2 shillings a week, and Turner joined her there from time to time. But the arrangement was unstable, and by early summer they had separated for what would prove to be the final time. By the summer of 1888, Martha Tabram had descended to the lowest rung of Victorian society. She was 39 years old, though the hard years had aged her beyond her time. She had moved from the room on Star Place, leaving behind unpaid rent and forcing a window one night to sleep in the room she had abandoned before disappearing again. She was now lodging at a common lodging house at 19 George Street, Spitalfields, the kind of establishment where 4pence bought a bed for the night, and questions about how one earned that 4pence were never asked. The last time William Turner saw her alive was on the afternoon of Saturday, the 4th of August, 1888, and when they met by chance at the Aldgate Pump, a landmark that still stands at the junction of Leadenhall Street and Aldgate High Street. She told him she had no money. He gave her 1 shilling and 6pence to purchase stock for hawking. They spoke for perhaps 20 minutes and then they parted. He would never see her again. The bank holiday Monday of the 6th of August, 1888, dawned gray and cold, another miserable day in what had been a miserable summer. The newspapers complained constantly about the rain and the lack of sunshine, and the streets of Whitechapel were muddy quagmires that swallowed boots and soaked through shawls. Martha spent that day as she spent most days, though the exact details of her movements remain unknown. What is certain is that by evening she had found a companion for the night's drinking, a woman named Mary Ann Connolly, known in the district as Pearly Poll. Connolly was a fellow prostitute, described by the newspapers as a tall, masculine-looking woman. She and Martha may have been friends, or they may simply have been 2 women who recognized in each other the shared desperation of their circumstances. According to Connolly's later testimony, which was inconsistent and possibly addled by the amount of alcohol she had consumed that night, they met at around 10 o'clock and began a tour of the public houses in the area. At some point during the evening, they encountered two soldiers, a corporal and a private, who were happy to buy drinks for the women in exchange for their company. Now we approach the final hours of Martha Tabram's life, and I want you to consider what we know and what we can never know. Two soldiers, in two women, and a night of drinking in the public houses of Whitechapel. The soldiers bought round after round. The women laughed and flirted and accepted the drinks that kept coming. If you are still with me, if you find yourself drawn into the shadows of that August night, tell me in the comments what you think happened next. Did Martha know the man who would kill her? Did she walk willingly into the darkness of George Yard, or was she taken there by force? At approximately 11 o'clock, Martha was seen by her sister-in-law, Ann Morris, entering the White Swan pub on Whitechapel High Street. She was alone at that moment, though she may have been meeting Connolly and the soldiers inside. By midnight, according to Connolly's testimony, the four of them left the pub together and headed along Whitechapel High Street. At the entrance to George Yard, they separated into pairs. Connolly and her soldier went to Angel Alley, a dark passage that still exists today and still possesses a menacing atmosphere. Martha and her soldier turned into George Yard. George Yard was one of the most dangerous streets in the locality, a narrow north-south alley connecting Wentworth Street and Whitechapel High Street. It was accessed from Whitechapel High Street through a covered archway next to the White Hart Inn, and once inside, a person was swallowed by darkness. On the left side of the alley near the northern end stood George Yard Buildings, a block of tenement flats built in 1876 and occupied by what the newspapers delicately described as people of the poorest description. The staircase lights were extinguished at 11 o'clock each night, plunging the landings into an impenetrable blackness that made them ideal for prostitutes and their clients seeking a few minutes of privacy. Martha Tabram would have known this place. She would have used it before. For a seasoned streetwalker, the dark landing of George Yard Buildings offered exactly the kind of seclusion her trade required. She led her soldier, or was led by him, into the building and up the stairs to the first-floor landing. What happened next was witnessed by no one, though the evidence of its violence would be discovered hours later. At 1:40 in the morning, Joseph and Elizabeth Mahoney, who lived at 37 George Yard Buildings, returned home after spending the bank holiday with friends. Elizabeth went out again immediately to purchase supper from a chandler's shop in nearby Thrall Street. Returning 5 minutes later, she passed the spot where Martha's body would be found but saw nothing in the darkness. The body could have been there, lying silent and bleeding on the landing, or the murder may not yet have occurred. We cannot know. At approximately 2 o'clock, Police Constable Thomas Barrett was walking his beat along Wentworth Street when he noticed a soldier loitering at the entrance to George Yard. Barrett remarked that it was quite time he was in barracks. The soldier replied that he was waiting for a comrade who had accompanied a woman to one of the buildings close at hand. Barrett accepted this explanation and continued on his rounds. He did not enter George Yard. He did not check the buildings. He simply walked on into the night. At 3:30 in the morning, Alfred George Crow, a 21-year-old cab driver, returned to his home in George Yard Buildings. As he climbed the stairs, he noticed someone lying on the first-floor landing. But because people often slept on the landings, he paid no attention. He could not say whether the figure was a man or a woman, alive or dead. He simply stepped past and continued to his room. The body lay there in the darkness for another hour and 15 minutes. Whatever sounds Martha made as she died, whatever pleas or screams escaped her lips, no one in that building full of sleeping residents heard anything. Or if they did, they dismissed it. Mrs. Hewitt, who lived nearby, would later admit that she had been awakened by cries of murder sometime in the night, but domestic violence was so common in Whitechapel that such cries were routinely ignored. At approximately 4:45 in the morning, a John Saunders Reeves, a casual waterside laborer, left his apartment on the top floor of George Yard buildings and descended the stairs. The light was now improving, and as he reached the first-floor landing, he could see clearly what Alfred Crowe had missed in the darkness. A woman was lying on her back in a pool of blood. Her clothes were disarranged, her skirts raised around her waist, her eyes were open and staring. Blood had soaked into the floorboards and pooled around her body. John Reeves ran into the street to find a policeman. Dr. Timothy Robert Killeen arrived at George Yard buildings at approximately 5:30 in the morning. What he found on that landing would haunt him for the rest of his career. The woman had been stabbed 39 times. The wounds covered her throat, her lungs, her heart, her liver, her spleen, her stomach, and her lower abdomen and her genitals. The attack had been a frenzy, a storm of violence so intense that it seemed impossible for one person to have inflicted it. Dr. Killeen estimated that she had been dead for approximately 3 hours, placing her murder sometime between 2 and 3:30 in the morning. The doctor made another significant observation. The wounds had been inflicted by 2 different weapons. The majority were consistent with an ordinary pocket knife, short and slim. But one wound, a deep thrust that had penetrated her chest bone, had been dealt by something longer and stouter, possibly a dagger or a sword bayonet. This detail would later lead investigators to focus on soldiers as the primary suspects, though the identity of Martha's killer would never be established. Before we examine the investigation that followed and the question that still divides historians today, I must ask you to consider what kind of person could inflict 39 stab wounds upon another human being. This was not a single thrust in the heat of an argument. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was sustained, methodical violence, the work of someone who continued stabbing long after his victim was dead. If you are still listening, if this account has compelled you to remain, then you understand why this case matters. Why Martha Tabram's death may hold the key to understanding the horrors that would follow in the autumn of 1888. The investigation was led by Inspector Edmund Reid of H Division, Whitechapel. The police faced immediate challenges. The victim was unknown to any of the tenants of George Yard buildings, and no one had seen or heard anything useful. A description was released to the newspapers. A woman between 35 and 40 years of age, approximately 5 feet 3 inches in height, with dark complexion and hair, wearing a dark green skirt, brown petticoat, long black jacket, and black bonnet. The body was photographed at the mortuary, and copies were distributed to officers who showed them to residents throughout the district. The soldier that Constable Barrett had encountered at the entrance to George Yard became a focus of the investigation. On the 7th of August, Barrett was escorted to the Tower of London, where a large military contingent was based, but he was unable to identify any of the soldiers paraded before him. He returned the next day and picked out 2 men, then immediately changed his mind about one of them. And the remaining suspect, John Leary, provided an alibi that was corroborated by another soldier, and he was released. Pearly Poll proved to be an unreliable witness. She failed to appear for an identity parade on the 10th of August and had to be tracked down by police. When she finally attended a parade at the Tower on the 13th, she declared that the soldiers she had been drinking with were not among those present. She then remembered that the men had worn white cap bands, indicating they were Coldstream Guards rather than the Grenadier Guards stationed at the Tower. Another parade was arranged at Wellington Barracks on the 15th. Connolly picked out 2 soldiers with confidence, but both had solid alibis. One had been home with his wife, the other had been in the barracks, and the police concluded that Pearly Poll was too unreliable to be trusted further. Meanwhile, the question of the victim's identity was being resolved. William Turner learned of the murder when friends told him about the inquest proceedings. He contacted police and identified the deceased as the woman he had lived with for 9 years. Henry Tabram, Martha's estranged husband, saw the name Tabram in the newspapers on the 13th of August and came forward to make a formal identification. The inquest resumed on the 23rd of August at the Working Lads Institute on Whitechapel Road, where Deputy Coroner George Collier heard testimony from Henry Tabram, William Turner, Mary Bousfield, Ann Morris, and Mary Ann Connolly. The coroner's summation captured the horror and frustration that the case had generated. It is one of the most terrible cases that anyone can possibly imagine, he declared. The man must have been a perfect savage to have attacked the woman in that way. The jury returned a verdict of willful murder by person or persons unknown. They added a recommendation that the stairs of George Yard buildings and other artisan dwellings should be lighted until after 11 o'clock at night. It was a small, practical suggestion in the face of incomprehensible violence. No one was ever arrested for Martha Tabram's murder. The investigation gradually wound down as other cases demanded attention. But 3 weeks later, on the 31st of August, 1888, the mutilated body of Mary Ann Nichols was discovered in Bucks Row, Whitechapel, lying on her back with her skirts raised around her waist in an almost identical pose to Martha Tabram. Her throat had been cut. Her abdomen had been slashed. The pattern had repeated, and the newspapers began to speculate that a serial killer was loose in the East End. Was Martha Tabram the first victim of Jack the Ripper? This question has divided historians and ripperologists for more than a century. The investigating officers at the time certainly believed she was connected to the later killings. Inspector Walter Dew, who worked the case, later wrote in his memoirs that there can be no doubt that the August bank holiday murder, which took place in George Yard buildings, was the handiwork of the Dread Ripper. Inspector Frederick Aberline, in an interview published in 1903, it referred to George Yard as where the first murder was committed. Those who exclude Martha from the canonical 5 Ripper victims point to the differences in method. The canonical victims all had their throats cut before they were mutilated. Martha was stabbed rather than slashed. She was not eviscerated in the manner of the later victims. Sir Melville McNacton, Assistant Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police, suggested in an 1894 memorandum that Martha had been murdered by a soldier, unconnected to the Ripper crimes. But McNacton joined the investigation late and made several factual errors in his notes. Those who include Martha point to the targeting of her throat and abdomen, the same areas that the Ripper would attack in his later victims. They suggest that Martha may have been an early experiment in a crime committed before the killer had perfected his method of incapacitating victims by cutting their throats. Serial killers often evolve their techniques over time, and the frenzied stabbing of Martha Tabram may represent the Ripper's first fumbling attempt at the kind of murder that would later become his signature. The truth is that we will never know. Martha Tabram was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave at the City of London Cemetery at Manor Park. No headstone marks her resting place. No flowers are laid upon her grave. She has been largely forgotten, overshadowed by the canonical 5 victims whose names are known to anyone who has heard of Jack the Ripper. But she was a woman who lived, who loved, who struggled against circumstances that would have defeated most, and who died alone and terrified on a dark landing in Whitechapel while the city slept around her. George Yard still exists, though it is now called Gunthorpe Street. The tenement buildings where Martha died were demolished long ago, replaced by newer structures that bear no trace of what occurred there. If you walk through that narrow alley today, you will see nothing remarkable, just another passage in a city full of passages, another street where people hurry past without pausing to consider what the stones beneath their feet might remember. 39 stab wounds. A woman whose life had been hard and whose death was harder. A killer who was never identified and never brought to justice. This is the case of Martha Tabram, and whether or not she was the first victim of Jack the Ripper, she deserves to be remembered as something more than a footnote in history. Thank you for joining me in this investigation. If this story has moved you, if you believe that forgotten victims deserve to have their stories told, then I ask you to subscribe to this channel, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and tell me where you are listening from tonight. Building this community means that we can continue to bring these voices out of the silence of history. I will see you in the next case.